As some of you know, excuse me, from last year, we are hoping to talk about a group of writers that we think have been wrestling with the question of revolution in the moment of history that we find ourselves. We talked about Tom Paine last year, and we're talking about Marx this year. I'm a person who started thinking about Marx and reading Marxism as a college student in the 1960s, and found it extraordinarily useful then, and have found it increasingly useful now. To talk about Marx, however, requires a few words in an American audience. Marx has been a taboo in this country for half a century. Very difficult to talk about anything that's been a taboo for half a century. In an earlier panel today, I used the image of a bear coming out of hibernation. We are a nation that's coming back to realize that for 50 years, during which Marxism spread to virtually every country on the earth, where it plays an important role, this country, like a 2-year-old, put its hands in front of its eyes and imagined that therefore the scary thing wasn't there anymore. In reality, Marxism has developed, multiplied, as it engages a variety of cultures, languages, traditions, religions, and social problems. And we as a nation are going to have to try to catch up because of the insights that Marxism had, which is one of the reasons why it grew that way, and because of the relevance that Chris so eloquently presented to us of many of his ideas. I noticed that when I went through my college and graduate school, I was never assigned one word of Karl Marx, all the way up to my PhD. There were occasional treatments, 10, 12 minutes of a valuable professor's time, during which, with great flourish, I was about to say he or she, but there weren't any she's then, he dispatched the Marxism with a couple of lines that we could memorize and repeat at cocktail parties in case the topic ever came up. And I went to what were called good universities in the United States. So we are rediscovering Marx, many of us. And that's an extremely important thing because there's a lot of catching up to do. So let me go into what strikes me as an economist that's so valuable. First, Marx is the one who first told me that every economic system of which we have record in the world is born, evolves, and changes over time, and then dies. Slavery, in various places and forms, was born, evolved, changed, and died. Feudalism was born, evolved, changed, and died. Capitalism was born, evolved, changed, and what? Probably going to die. The burden is not on us, the critics, to suggest that it's going to die. The burden is on those who would want us to believe anything else is a reasonable supposition. And I think the signs are accumulating that if not dying, whatever we're seeing is not impressive growth. As the just released statistics indicating that the US economy shrunk in the last quarter would have to confirm. Marx's reaction to the system he grew up in was, on the one hand, to be excited about the birth of capitalism. Marx was always taken with that. He was a child of the French Revolution and catapulted into ecstasy, literally, by those slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, that motivated the French Revolution. That's what he wanted: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he loved the French Revolution because in that dramatic sequence of events, feudalism was forever destroyed in France. The institutions that had supported it, serfdom, the church, and so on, were cast into a shadow from which in France for sure, but elsewhere, it has never recovered. And he got also caught up in the idea that with the passing of feudalism, the new system emerging, capitalism, would be part of the means to realize liberty, equality, and fraternity. Capitalism would deliver liberty, equality, fraternity, and we should add democracy, as Marx made clear. He hoped for that. He believed in that. He celebrated the French Revolution for that. But he came half a century after the French Revolution into his maturity. And he looked around Germany, into which capitalism was coming, and he reached what was for him an epiphany kind of recognition of something. Capitalism indeed had replaced feudalism, but capitalism was not delivering liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. It wasn't. The promise of the French Revolution had been broken. And Marx was shaken. The more he looked around at the conditions people lived in under capitalism and that were being reproduced on a growing scale, the more he realized that capitalism not only wasn't the vehicle to bring the promise of the French Revolution, it was the obstacle to their realization. And so he set himself a task. How come? How? Why is capitalism that promised to be the liberation? Why has it failed? Why does it not work that way? And here's his answer, which for me is his greatest contribution. He said the drive for liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy overthrew slavery. That was necessary, but it wasn't enough. It didn't deliver liberty, equality, or fraternity. And the overthrow of feudalism didn't do it either. And the delivery of capitalism hasn't brought it either. What's going on? And his answer is called the theory of the surplus. And here's how it goes. Real simple. Just a simple idea. In slavery, human beings, slaves, produce a lot of output. Part of the output is given back to them by the master to keep them going, to feed them and clothe them and enable them to come back and do work the next day. But the slaves always produce more than that. They produce a surplus, an output larger than what they themselves consume. And that surplus is what the master takes and uses to build whatever civilization the master wants, to sustain the people who will keep the slaves in line in case they ever get the idea to break out of this system. In feudalism, Marx says, the successor to slavery in many parts of the world, the same thing. Feudalism overthrew slavery. It made it impossible for one person to be owned by another. People were no longer property. That was an advance. But in feudalism, Marx said, and he was a close student of it, the serfs, the masses of people on the land, produced an output which was larger than what they themselves consumed. And that larger, that extra, that surplus was delivered to someone called the lord, the feudal lord of the manor. And the name in European feudalism for that surplus delivered by the peasant who produced more than he or she got to keep, got the name rent, which is with us still and carries the same aroma. The feudal serf produces a surplus that somebody else gets. The Lord gets it, and the Lord creates with it, well, among other things, those fantastic chateaux on the River Loire that we can go and visit in Europe, and the cathedrals and all the rest of it. And it sustains those men in those heavy metal uniforms with the long sticks to beat up on the serfs when, and if they got the idea this wasn't the ideal arrangement. And capitalism then threw away slavery and threw away feudalism and erected something else. And Marx said, maybe in capitalism too, there is something like what's in slavery and feudalism. There's a mechanism in which some people produce a surplus that other people get, who use it to erect a civilization that includes the police and the army to make sure that the workers who produce a surplus don't rebel against that situation. That's what capital is about. The first volume of Capital is a detailed explanation of how, why, and where workers who produce a surplus they don't get, that goes to somebody else. And the simplest way to explain it, in plain English, when you go for a job, any of you all had this experience. You go for a job, you have a conversation with your employer, and you go through the details. I'm going to come on Monday and Wednesday, or Monday, Wednesday to Friday, and all the rest. And I'm going to come at 9 o'clock and leave at 5, and all the rest of it, and you go through all of that. And then you get to that meaty part. How much am I going to get paid? And the employer and you dicker back and forth, and let's say you arrive at $20 an hour. At that point, Marx says, the worker knows without knowing it what I have just understood about the system. That there is no way on earth that the employer would ever give you $20 for an hour of your labor unless the following sentence were true. In that hour, you contribute more to what that employer has to sell than the $20 he gives you. In Marx's language, you produce a surplus. The implication, if you've ever uttered the following phrase to yourself, I'm never going to work for anyone who doesn't pay me what I'm worth, you don't understand the system. That's never going to happen. You're going to get paid what you're worth on the same day that you fly over this building. You've come to accept that you cannot fly over the building. And until you read Marx, you may also accept that work is always a process of you producing a surplus for somebody else. Marx's argument is the breakout of slavery wasn't enough. The breakout from feudalism is enough. You got to break out from capitalism. But he told us how to do that. If you don't want a society that is conflictual at its core, a society that has organized production of the goods and services without which we can't live, by putting together one group of people who are ripping off the surplus produced by another. That's like organizing your family picnic by picking the two relatives who hate each other the most to organize it. It's not a smart move. Capitalism creates a production structure fraught with conflict, jealousy, evil, and anger. It's only a question of how, where, and when it erupts. It's a system built on something which Marx showed us can be superseded. What is the answer Marx provides? And he doesn't spend much time on answer. It's like Chris said it, Marx wasn't going to guess when the changes would come. Marx's answer is precise. We will get liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy if and only if, when and only when, we break with the tradition of economic systems in which the mass of people produce a surplus that a minority of people get and utilize to keep themselves in that situation. Therefore, the next stage of human society, if liberty, equality, democracy, and fraternity are what we want, is clearly defined. It has to be that the people who do the work, the majority, make the decisions, are their own employers. We've finished with the tradition of some people being the drones and others the queen bees. Some producing the surplus and no. We're going to collectivize and democratize the process of producing surplus. We're going to make production a community affair, a communal affair, or, scary as it is, a communist affair. It is going to be the people who produce the surplus who receive it and who decide what to do with it. And that takes the conflict out of the production process, takes the class division and the class struggle out of the process, and begins the capability of modern society to create the concrete realization of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Final thought. We don't make that change. This is a bitter lesson of the 20th century. It is not enough for the state to replace the private sector to take over production. It's not enough to replace a market with planning, because those two things, however useful and valuable, do not get at what Marx focused us on, the production of surplus, the organization of the production process in a store, in an office, in a factory, that pits one group to prove. If the mass of workers produce for state officials, we still got the problem. In the end, if you want an economic system that works for the people, then the people have to be in charge. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. And Marx laid out what that means, the analysis of the surplus, how it's produced, and what follows from that arrangement. To get back to where I started, the one concept that my teachers were stumped by if I raised my hand in my classes in the university in economics. I could ask about prices and wages and employment. They knew what those concepts meant. But when I raised my hand and I said, well, what about the surplus? They looked at me as if I had just switched from English to Urdu. And they didn't speak Urdu. And there was that awkward silence, and I sat down, and I had in my head at least the pleasure. I made that person uncomfortable for a few seconds. Marx did an amazing piece of work. Did everything he say crystal clear? No. Did everything he predicted correct? No. We're not here for playing games and false gods. But the insights the fellow achieved, the care with which he presented them, a society that would not let its young people in the schools for 50 years engage with that intellect did nobody any favors. That's part of what has to be overcome in a society that grows up, comes out of its long hibernating taboo, and learns all that this master intellect has to teach us. Thank you very much.